There's a particular kind of morning that feels different from all the others. And you know exactly what I'm talking about, even if you've never mentioned it to anyone, even if you've kept it locked inside like a secret you're ashamed to admit. A morning where opening your eyes doesn't bring relief or possibility, but instead delivers something closer to a quiet, suffocating weight that settles on our chest before you've even fully returned to consciousness. And in that moment, before your thoughts have arranged themselves into coherent sentences, you already know that getting out of bed will require a kind of effort that has nothing to do with physical tiredness, an effort so profound and so inexplicable that it frightens you because you can't point to any single reason why something as saucial and automatic as standing up and beginning your day should suddenly feel like pushing against an invisible wall made of lead and fog and something you can't quite name, but that feels uncomfortably close to meaninglessness itself. It's not that you're in pain, not exactly, and it's not that you're sad in the traditional sense where you might cry or feel a sharp ache in your heart, but rather that everything has become covered in a kind of grey film, a translucent barrier between you and the world that makes even the thought of showering or making coffee or greeting another human being feel like an elaborate performance you no longer have the script for. And what's worse, what really digs into you with cold fingers, is that you look around at other people who seem to move through their mornings with ease, who laugh at things on their phones while waiting for the bus, who hum along to songs and make plans for the weekend, and you wonder what fundamental piece of yourself has broken or gone missing that you can no longer access that same lightness, that same unthinking participation in the basic rituals of being alive. You start to ask yourself questions in the silence of your bedroom, questions that circle like vultures, waiting for something to die. Questions like whether you're depressed in the clinical sense that would justify seeing someone or taking something or explaining this heaviness to people who care about you, or whether you're simply weak, simply less resilient than you thought, simply someone who can't handle the ordinary pressures that everyone else seems to absorb without complaint. And sometimes late at night, when you can't sleep, you scroll through symptoms on your phone, trying to match what you feel to some named condition, some recognized pattern that would at least give you the comfort of knowing this has happened to others and has a treatment and an end point, but nothing quite fit. Chaos because you're still functioning, still going through the motions, still managing to show up and perform the basic requirements of your life, even as something inside you has gone terrifyingly quiet. And that disconnect between your external functioning and your internal emptiness makes you wonder if maybe you're not sick at all but simply cold, simply someone whose capacity for joy and connection has been revealed as shallower than you wanted to believe. And that possibility, that you might just be discovering your own emotional poverty, your own fundamental inability to feel things the way other people feel them, is perhaps the most disturbing thought of all, because it suggests this isn't a phase or a condition, but simply who you are beneath the performance you've been maintaining for years. You catch yourself going through entire conversations where you're saying the right things and making the appropriate facial expressions, but watching yourself from a strange distance, as if you're operating your own body by remote control. And afterwards, you can't remember what was said because you weren't really there, you were somewhere else, somewhere far away and very quiet, and you start to fear that people can see this absence in you, this hollowness, that when they look into your eyes they see something missing that used to be there, some light or warmth or genuine interest that has been replaced by a skillful imitation of human engagement. And the shame of this, the deep and cutting shame of feeling like you're becoming someone who can't connect, who can't care, who can't feel the things that supposedly make life worth living, sits in your stomach like a stone you can't digest, and you wonder if this is what it means to be broken in a way that can't be fixed. Broken, not like a bone that heals or a wound that closes, but broken like something fundamental to your design, some essential mechanism that has simply stopped working and left you capable of survival, but not of living. But what if I told you that what you're experiencing isn't a malfunction at all, isn't a sign of depression or weakness or emotional damage, but rather something far stranger and far more significant, something that almost no one talks about, because we don't have good language for it and because it frightens people who haven't been through it, something that might best be described as a kind of involuntary waking up, a shift in the basic frequency at which your consciousness operates, that makes the old ways of being, The old sources of meaning and pleasure and motivation suddenly stop working, not because you're broken, but because you've outgrown them in a way that your conscious mind hasn't yet recognized or accepted. Richard Feynman, the physicist who spent his life peering beneath the surface of reality, once described how the more deeply you understand how something actually works, the harder it becomes to be satisfied with the simple stories we tell about it. How knowledge has a way of stripping away the comforting illusions that make ordinary existence feel meaningful and coherent. And while he was talking, Jay, about physics, about the strange and sometimes disturbing truths that emerge when you really look at how the universe operates beneath its familiar surface. The same principle applies to consciousness, to the experience of being a person moving through time, because there comes a point in some people's lives when they begin to see through the mechanisms that previously kept them engaged, kept the time wanting things and chasing things and believing in the importance of things. And once you see the mechanism, once you understand at a gut level how arbitrary and constructed most of what drives human behavior actually is, you can't unsee it, can't go back to the innocent participation you once had. And this isn't enlightenment in the spiritual sense, isn't some glorious awakening into bliss and cosmic understanding, but rather a much more uncomfortable and disorienting recognition that most of what you thought was real and important is actually a kind of agreed-upon hallucination, a collective dream that works only as long as everyone keeps believing in it together. Think of it like this, like spending your entire life inside a theater watching a play, completely absorbed in the story, moved by the drama, invested in the characters, your heart racing during the tense moments and swelling during the touching ones. And then one day, for reasons you can't control, you suddenly become aware of the stage itself, of the painted backdrops and the actors saying their lines and the lights being operated from the booth in the back. And once you see the machinery of the production, you can't go back to being fully absorbed in the story anymore. You can't forget that what you're watching is a performance. And this doesn't mean the play is bad or worthless, doesn't mean the actors aren't skilled or the story isn't well crafted, but it does mean that your relationship to it has fundamentally changed. You're no longer inside it in the same way, no longer able to lose yourself in the illusion because you're too aware of how the illusion is being created. And this is what's happening to you when getting out of bed becomes an effort, when the ordinary rewards and pleasures and motivations that used to move you through your days stop working because you've started to see them as mechanisms, as constructs, as things you're supposed to want and care about, rather than things you genuinely want and care about in some unquestioned, automatic way. The dopamine hit from social media likes, the satisfaction of checking things off a to-do list, the pleasure of buying something new, the meaning you derived from your role at work or in your relationships or in whatever identity you'd built for yourself. All of these things that once felt real and important now feel thin, feel like you're going through motions that served some purpose you no longer remember or believe in, and the people around you are still inside the theater, still fully absorbed in their plays, and they can't understand why you're sitting there staring at the curtain with this look of exhausted bewilderment on your face, why you can't just enjoy the show like everyone else. What you're experiencing in those heavy mornings, in that grey distance between you and the world, isn't emptiness in the sense of something being missing, but rather emptiness in the sense of a space being cleared, an old structure being dismantled before a new one can be built. And I know that doesn't make the feeling any less uncomfortable, doesn't make it any easier to drag yourself through days that feel like you're walking through water, but it might at least help to know that this isn't a descent into permanent numbness or depression, but a transition, a passage between two different ways of existing that requires you to spend some time in a kind of liminal space where the old sources of meaning have stopped working, but the new ones haven't yet revealed themselves. The problem is that we live in a culture absolutely addicted to stimulation, to constant input and output, to filling every moment with content and activity and achievement, and we've learned to mistake that constant stimulation for engagement with life itself. We've confused being busy and distracted and entertained with being alive, and so when the stimulation stops working, when you find yours, unable to care about the things that are supposed to excite you or motivate you or give your days structure and purpose, you assume something is wrong with you, rather than recognizing that you've simply become conscious of your addiction to a particular kind of psychological noise, and like anyone going through withdrawal from a substance they've depended on, you feel terrible, feel empty and restless and unable to settle. But that discomfort is actually your nervous system recalibrating, learning to function without the constant hits of external validation and artificial urgency that have been driving you for so long. The loneliness you feel, the sense of being isolated even when surrounded by people, isn't a sign that you're incapable of connection, but rather that you're no longer able to connect in the shallow, performative ways that most social interaction requires. You've lost the ability to pretend that small talk matters, to laugh at jokes you don't find funny, to express enthusiasm for things you don't care about, to maintain the elaborate dance of social niceties that keeps most relationships functioning smoothly. And this makes you feel like you're failing at being human, like there's something cold and wrong about you. But what's actually happening is that your tolerance for inauthenticity has dropped to almost zero. Your capacity to engage in interactions that don't touch something real and genuine has simply evaporated. And while this makes casual socializing nearly impossible for a while it might mean you spend more time alone than you used to, it isn't a permanent state, but rather a necessary withdrawal from the kinds of connection that no longer feed you, a fallow period where your capacity for genuine intimacy can develop without being crowded out by 1,000 superficial engagements that leave you feeling more alone than if you'd been by yourself. The same is true for pleasure, for the ordinary enjoyments that used to punctuate your days, the good meal, the funny show, the beautiful sunset, the song that used to make you feel something, because right now those things wash over you without leaving any impression, like water rolling off glass, and you worry that you've lost your capacity for joy, that some essential part of your humanity has been amputated. But what's really happening is that you've burned through the easy pleasures, the surface-level satisfactions that work on your reward systems without requiring any deeper participation, and your nervous system, having adapted to constant hits of shallow pleasure, is now in a period of desensitization where those easy rewards no longer register, and this is deeply uncomfortable. Feels like walking through a world drained of color, but it's also creating space for a different kind of satisfaction to emerge, something quieter and more stable that doesn't depend on constant novelty or stimulation, but rather on a kind of basic okayness with existence itself, a fundamental sense of being all right, that isn't about happiness in the conventional sense, but about something deeper and harder to name. And here's where you need to be very careful, because it's extremely tempting to take this experience of seeing through the ordinary illusions and turn it into a new identity, a new story about yourself as someone who's more awake or aware or conscious than the people around you, to feel a kind of superior detachment from all those poor souls still caught up in their small dramas and trivial purrs. Still chasing things you now see as empty and constructed. And this is perhaps the most dangerous trap of all, because it takes a genuine shift in consciousness and turns it into fuel for the ego, into a new way of feeling special and separate. And suddenly you're not someone going through a difficult transition, but someone who's transcended the game while everyone else is still playing it. And this is bullshit. This is your mind trying to make sense of an uncomfortable experience by turning it into a flattering narrative, and it will make you insufferable, will make you cold and judgmental and isolated. Not because you're too conscious to connect with people, but because you're using consciousness as a shield against vulnerability, as an excuse not to show up for the messy, imperfect, very human business of actually caring about things and people, even when you can see all their flaws and limitations and arbitrary qualities. The fact that you can see how much of human meaning is constructed, how much of what people care about is essentially made up, doesn't mean those things aren't worth engaging with, doesn't give you permission to float above it all in some position of ironic detachment, because you're not above it, you're still in it, still a person who needs connection and purpose and something to care about, even if your relationship to those needs has become more complicated and self-aware. What you're looking for, what you're moving toward, even though it doesn't feel like movement, because you're spending so much time in apparent stillness and emptiness, isn't a return to the old enthusiasms and easy pleasures, isn't about getting back to normal or fixing whatever you think is broken in you, but rather about finding a new way to be engaged with existence that doesn't depend on tie-on or constant stimulation, that can accommodate your awareness of how arbitrary and constructed everything is, while still allowing you to participate, to care, to find meaning, not because you've tricked yourself into believing in something, but because you've made a conscious choice to invest yourself in certain people and projects and experiences, even while knowing, even while holding the knoll. DG that none of it is cosmically significant or permanently meaningful in any absolute sense. This is what Feynman understood about the universe, that you could know how the mechanism works, could see all the way down to the quantum level, where nothing is solid and everything is probability and uncertainty, and still find beauty in a flower, still love your wife, still get excited about solving a problem, not because you'd forgotten what you knew, but because you'd learned to hold knowledge. Turn participation simultaneously, to be both aware and engaged, both conscious of the construction and willing to enter into it anyway. The mornings will get easier not because you'll go back to who you were before this started, not because the weight will simply lift one day and you'll wake up refreshed and enthusiastic about your normal routines, but because you'll gradually develop a new relationship with effort itself. Will stop expecting your days to be carried forward by automatic enthusiasm and external motivation, and You'd learn to move through the world with a kind of deliberate, conscious participation that doesn't require you to feel intensely excited or motivated, but only to show up, to be present, to do the next thing without demanding that it give you some big feeling in return. The happiness you're capable of now, the joy that's available on the other side of this transition, won't look like the happiness you remember or the happiness you see other people having, won't be the bright, sparkly, shareable kind of happiness that photographs well and makes good stories, but will instead be something quieter, something more like a deep okayness, a fundamental absence of resist. Turns to existence itself, moments where you're doing something simple, making tea or walking or talking to someone, and you realize you're not somewhere else in your head, not wishing the moment was different or waiting for it to be over, but actually there, actually present, and that presence doesn't feel ecstatic or even particularly pleasant, but it feels real in a way that all your previous pleasures and excitement somehow weren't. Feels like you've stopped watching yourself live and started actually living, and these moments will be brief at first, will come and go without warning, but they'll gradually become more frequent, will start to form the ground of your experience rather than occasional interruptions in your usual distance and disconnection. You'll find yourself able to care about things again, able to want things and work toward things and get excited about things, but the caring will have a different quality, will be something you're doing consciously, rather than something that's happening to you, will feel less like being swept up in a current and more like choosing to swim in a particular direction. And with that choice comes freedom and responsibility, comes the knowledge that your engagement is yours, is something you're creating rather than discovering. And while that might sound less romantic than believing in predetermined passions and cosmic purposes, it's actually far more powerful because it means you're not dependent on finding the right thing or the right person or the right circumstance to make your life meaningful, but rather that you carry the capacity for meaning-making within yourself, can bring it to whatever situation or relationship or work you find yourself in. And slowly, gradually, in ways you won't notice until you look back and realize how different you feel from those mornings when getting out of bed felt impossible, you'll find that the effort has changed, that the basic acts of living have become less heavy not because they've gotten easier, but because you've gotten stronger, because you've developed a kind of psychological musculature that can carry you through days that aren't particularly exciting or meaningful or full of obvious rewards, can keep you showing up and participating even when there's no big payoff, no guarantee that any of this matters, no cosmic assurance that you're doing the right thing or becoming the right person or moving in the right direction, and that capacity to continue without those assurances, to live without needing constant evidence that you're on the right path, is perhaps the closest thing to genuine freedom that a conscious being can experience, because it means you're no longer at the mercy of your feelings, no longer dependent on motivation or inspiration or enthusiasm to carry you forward, but have learned to move through the world with a kind of deliberate intention that doesn't require you to feel any particular way about it. And in that space, in that gap between what you feel and what you do, you become something more than just a bundle of reactions and conditioned responses, become something that might actually be called free. So when the mornings are heavy, when getting out of bed feels like an effort you can't justify or explain, try to remember that what you're experiencing isn't a breakdown, but a breakthrough that hasn't completed itself yet, isn't damage but development, isn't the end of your capacity for engagement, but the beginning of a different kind of engagement entirely, one that doesn't depend on illusion or a distraction or constant stimulation, but can meet reality as it actually is, can look at the mechanism and choose to participate anyway, can hold both awareness and caring in the same moment without one cancelling out the other. And yes, this is difficult. Yes, this requires you to spend time in a kind of grey transitional space where nothing makes sense and everything feels flat, and you wonder if you'll ever feel anything real again. But you will. You're feeling something real right now, even if it doesn't feel like what you think real feeling should feel like. And that discomfort, that weight, that effort, they're not evidence of failure, but evidence that something genuine is happening, something that matters more than any easy pleasure or shallow satisfaction ever could. And you don't need to know where it's taking you or what you'll be like on the other side. You only need to trust that getting out of bed, putting your feet on the floor, standing up even when it feels impossible, is enough, is exactly what this moment requires. And that's all any of us can do, is all anyone has ever done, is the whole practice of being human, and you're doing it, even when it doesn't feel like it, even when every cell in your body wants to pull the covers back over your head and disappear. You're doing it, and that matters in ways you can't see yet, but will, in time. When you look back and realize that this was when everything changed, this was when you became real.